As you may know, we are in a new sermon series called Women of the Bible. And we are looking at a fascinating individual today, and we are looking in the Old Testament. I like the Old Testament. There are so many good stories in the Old Testament. And particularly, some of my favorites are one of the books we're going to look at today, Judges. Samuel and Kings are also fantastic books. I really enjoy reading through these Old Testament stories and seeing how God relates with people and how people relate with God. You know, as I look through some of these stories, and particularly with the Israelites, I sense some frustration on the part of God with his people. Do you ever sense that when you're reading through the Old Testament? And as a parent, sometimes you get frustrated with how your kids act. Is that true or false? That's true sometimes, right? Kids today do some crazy stuff, and the internet doesn't help, does it? One of the more interesting things and one of the more stupid things that I've seen in the last, my whole life was the Tide Pod Craze. Anybody read about the Tide Pod Craze with kids? It was a challenge where kids would take dish soap Tide Pods and swallow them. Now, anyone who has half of a brain knows that's a terrible idea, swallowing Tide Pods. But there was this challenge that went viral all over the place, and these kids, by the thousands, were swallowing Tide Pods. And parents all over the place were thinking, what on earth are they thinking? There was another challenge called the Salt and Ice Challenge, where they put, I believe, salt, I'm not even sure of the combination, but a combination of salt and ice on their skin, which somehow has a reaction that gives them frostbite immediately. And these kids were making videos of themselves, essentially giving themselves frostbite. There's another game that went viral across the internet, lots of different countries, and it was a choking game where kids would choke themselves and make themselves pass out. I don't know about you, but when I read through these things, I'm like, what in the world? What are people thinking? Then there was the cinnamon challenge long ago, and adults got in on this one. Anybody remember the cinnamon challenge? There was probably the most famous video of the cinnamon challenge was a lady named Glozell. And that one, 50 million views or something like that on this poor lady swallowing a tablespoon of cinnamon. Unbelievable, the stuff that people do. And we look at these things and say, what on earth are you thinking? That is the worst idea ever. And I think that's a little bit how God felt with the Israelites a lot of the time. What are you doing? Why on earth would you do that? Now, we're going to exclude ourselves from this because we probably don't do that to God. For sure, it was only the Israelites, right? God, I think, spent a lot of his time, and still does, looking at his people and saying, what are you doing? Why would you do that? Why on earth would you do that? We're going to look in the book of Judges today, Judges chapter 3. Turn in your Bibles to Judges chapter 3. We're going to focus on 4 mostly, but 3 gives us a little bit of a heads up as to what's going on. There is a cycle that happens over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament. And the cycle goes like this. God's people are faithful, and then they're not. And they walk away from God, and God says, okay, I'll respect your choice, but you're going to have to deal with the consequences of your choices. And then time goes by, and they realize those were terrible choices, and at some point they say, God, help us out. God comes in, God helps them out, brings in somebody to help them out, a savior, a judge of some sort, and they have peace, and they are close to God. And then they fall away from God again. And they make their own choices, and God respects those choices. Then they see what happens when they make those choices. They deal with those consequences, and once again, after a certain period of time, they call to God to come help them again, and God comes and helps them again. And this cycle goes on over and over and over, more times than I can count in the Bible. I am so glad that God describes himself as a faithful and patient God. Because I don't know about in your life, but in my life, I'm glad that God has been patient with me and not given up on me. In this time, God looks at his people. They're participating in fertility rites, sacrificing their children, which, by the way, is something that the devil has gotten people to do over and over again for thousands of years. We were just reading in our preteen Sabbath school class a missionary story from just, late 1800s, where they were sacrificing people into a volcano to try and appease the god in the volcano. The idea of sacrifice has been tainted by the devil for so long. And he does it in the very worst way. Take your kid, who is made in the image of God, and sacrifice that kid. He sees the Israelites doing this, bowing down to idols, etc., etc. In the story right before the one we're going to look at today, the story of Ehud, which, by the way, is a wild story. Some of these stories are just the most dramatic stories you can imagine. Ehud, go read that one this afternoon in Judges chapter 3. They'd done wrong. Ehud comes and saves them. Moab were the ones that were oppressing them at the time. And then in chapter 3, verse 30, it says, "So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel. And the land had rest for how many years? 80 whole years. The land had rest and they had peace." Now, I often wonder if there's peace in my life and everything is going smoothly, I sometimes wonder what's going wrong. There's too much peace in my life. Why is the devil leaving me alone? I can't see what's behind the curtain. But I find myself thinking, if I have an easy life, or I'm having an easy time in life, maybe I'm not trying hard enough to work for God. Maybe the devil's not upset with me like he should be. Because I think as Christians, we need to be living our lives where the devil's like, man, we got to put a stop to this guy. We got to put a stop to this lady. She's doing way too much for God's work. Isn't it funny how in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, they say, count it a blessing when you're going through trials? Isn't that a tough verse? None of us want to go through trials, right? Trials are rough. Israel has peace for 80 years. It seems that long periods of easy life make us lax in our spiritual walk. 80 years they had peace. And in the Old Testament, there are names that are dropped where we don't know much about these people, but it'll drop like a verse of something wildly heroic that somebody did, and you don't know anything else about them really after that. That's what the last verse of chapter 3 is. There's a guy named Shamgar that's mentioned here. Shamgar. How many of you ever heard of Shamgar before? Anybody? Probably not. Shamgar was a big deal. In fact, Deborah sings about Shamgar in chapter 5. She mentions him. Shamgar. Who was Shamgar? Who was this guy? In verse 31 of chapter 3, it says, after him, so this would be after Ehud, was Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. Time out for just a second. What just happened? Israel is being oppressed. And when I say oppressed, when the Bible talks about oppression, when Israel is oppressed, that means another nation comes in and they are servants of those people. They pay taxes to those people. They do whatever they say. At this point, a lot of the oppressors wouldn't even allow Israel to have weapons. And we'll see this later on in the story in chapter 4. They aren't even allowed to have weapons. Why? Well, because if they have weapons, they'll probably at some point revolt. So let's just not let them have any weapons. We see in the Old Testament where to get their farm equipment taken care of, they had to go to the Philistines. They weren't even allowed to have blacksmiths because they might make swords. And so God doesn't need swords. God doesn't even need spears or shields to take care of things. And so when Israel is being oppressed, they might be taking their family members away from them. If a Philistine or a Moabite sees your daughter and he likes her, do you have a say in if they take her? No. Oftentimes you're going hungry. Your kids are going hungry. When the Bible talks about oppression, your existence is absolutely miserable. Absolutely miserable. And you will do anything to be free from that. You need someone to take care of that. And God, over and over again, sends a hero. We don't know really anything about Shamgar other than he stood up for the Israelites. He was God's man, and he was not afraid of 600 Philistines, and he didn't even have a sword. Now, here I want you to see who is the problem in this story so far. The Philistines, right? Do the Israelites see any type of real solution? They don't have swords, they don't have anything like that. But you see, when there is a problem in our lives, God is not limited to our solutions. When the Israelites are seeing 600 well-armed Philistines, they don't realize that Shamgar and God have had a talk. And Shamgar doesn't even need a sword. He has an ox goad. You know what that is? An ox goad is a stick with a pointy end on it. Any kid here with a pocket knife could make one. In fact, if you've ever had a pocket knife, you have made one. It's a stick with a pointy end on it. And Shamgar sees 600 Philistines, and he says, God has said it's enough. And he stands up, and he fights 600 Philistines, 600 against one. And he's got a sharp stick. That's it. But through the power of God, he saves Israel with one man and one stick against a whole army. Do you have problems in your life? Do you have challenges in your life? Remember the God that you serve. All right, we got to get into the story of Deborah. Chapter 4. Now when Ehud had died, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth-haggim. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now in your imagination, remember to picture what it would be like to be harshly oppressed. Now, verse 4, we are introduced to somebody new. Now, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. Now, what does she plays several different roles here? We see several different roles played by this lady named Deborah. Now, first of all, it mentions that she is a prophetess. What does it mean to have a prophetic gift? First of all, it's of note that of all of the judges that are mentioned in the book of Judges, she is the only judge that has a prophetic gift. The only one. God and Deborah are very, very close. Close enough that God will tell Deborah what's going on ahead of time even in a prophetic message. Maybe that even has to do with some of her judgments, because her second job is being a judge. Now, if you're a parent, maybe you've had this happen. If you have more than one kid, you have two kids come up to you, and they're upset. There has been a wrong that has happened. And one kid has one story, and the other kid has another story. And you're the judge. You ever been in that situation before? That's a tough situation, isn't it? You don't know what the truth is. You got two kids, you love both your kids. They're telling you two versions of the same story, and they want you to make a judgment call. Get them in trouble. No, get them in trouble. But you don't even know who should be in trouble. Remember the story of Solomon with the two ladies and the two babies? Remember that? Tough. It is tough being a judge and finding out which is right and which is wrong. Deborah would sit out under a tree in the mountains of Ephraim, it says. And in those mountains is right where Joshua is buried, right there in those mountains, close by. Joshua has just died, we see in the beginning of the book of Judges. And the Joshua has been buried right close by. This is where she's setting up her chair, and people come and bring their grievances, and she helps the people of Israel settle quarrels and find out what's right and what is wrong. Deborah is also a wife. It mentions her husband's name, Lapidoth. Now, this is a marriage that I would have liked to have witnessed and watched. These two must have had a very close relationship with God and each other. They're supportive of each other. Lapidoth is supportive of the role that God has chosen his wife to play in leadership in Israel. So much we're going to see that it would test probably any one of us husbands if it was our wife. Let's continue on. Verse 5. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel. The place where she meets is called the palm tree of Deborah. That's her place. It's named after her. They go to the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. And she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, Go and deploy troops to Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon. And I will deliver him into your hand. God has spoken with Deborah. And it sounds like maybe even with Barak. The way it's worded is, hasn't God, asking him a question, don't you know that God has sent us this message? You are to take 10,000 of your men, and you are to go and fight against Sisera. The time of our bondage is over. God sends this message to Deborah. And Barak's, his response is quite interesting. He says to Deborah, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you won't go, then I'm not going either. Kind of an interesting response from Barak. Now, there's also if he's being chosen to lead and recruit 10,000 soldiers, remember, these are 10,000 soldiers who have been oppressed, 10,000 soldiers who are at a disadvantage, 10,000 soldiers who probably don't even have weapons. This is going to be the sales job of the decade, to recruit soldiers to come and fight against Sisera. And Barak says, look, if you come, then I'll go. And there's wisdom in that too. Maybe a little bit of fear, but a little wisdom too, because if Deborah is by his side, everybody knows Deborah, right? When there's a problem, they go to Deborah because they believe Deborah has divine insight onto the problems. They believe that God communicates with Deborah. And Barak says, look, I need you to come with me to battle. When they see you, they'll know this endeavor is of God. Now, what does Deborah say? What does the wife of Lapidoth say? The prophetess and the judge of Israel. She responds to Barak in verse 9 and says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Now, Deborah here is not speaking about herself, by the way. She's not talking about herself in the glory of the win of this battle. Now, there was always a lot to do with somebody, a general who won a battle. All kinds of praise. If you recall back to the story of David and Goliath, remember the parade that they had when they came back and they said, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s, right? When you win a big battle, there's a big celebration for you. And what she says here is she says, okay, I'll go with you, but it's going to take away any honor you would have from winning this. In fact, it'll go to somebody else. Someone else will get the honor for the victory here. So, verse 10, Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali and Kadesh, and he went up with 10,000 men under his command. And Deborah went up with him. Now, as I read that last part this week, I thought to myself, this is very unique to have, especially in this time period, to have a woman, a wife, going into battle. We don't see something like this every day in the Bible, do we? Now, what would you fellas think if that was your wife going into battle? That would be an interesting scenario, wouldn't it? Back then, now battle's terrible, but back then, battle was even worse. And bad things happened to women in battle. They were taken. They had to serve. They were taken on as extra wives. What was it about the marriage of Lapidoth and Deborah where he was okay with his wife going and leading men in battle? What did they have in their marriage? I think the two of them had some of the most amazing trust in God out of anybody that's ever been married. Deborah specifically says that God will go before us, that God will win this battle for us. Lapidoth, the husband, had to have 100% confidence that that was right. He and Deborah must have had a conversation. Wait, you're going where? You're going into battle with Barak? Oh, okay. God said it was going to be okay? All right then. There is a connection between this husband and wife that is not spoken about in Scripture, but is hugely implicated. That the two of them were close to each other and close to God. And they trusted everything to God. Even the most difficult situations in their lives, they trusted to God. Now, do you think it was easy for Lapidoth to stay home while his wife went off to battle? Or maybe he's one of the soldiers that got recruited? And yet, this husband and wife pair have full trust that God is controlling this huge situation. I want to challenge those of you that are married today to make the goal of your marriage to be like Deborah and Lapidoth. To have that connection with Jesus together so that when you face uncertainty, when you face a battle in your lives, you are facing it together and with Jesus. With the full trust knowing that Jesus will help you make it through whatever you're going through. Marriage is hard. Nobody ever said marriage was easy. And if they did, they're lying. Marriage is tough. But if you stick together and stick with Jesus, He will help you make it through the toughest of situations. Verse 10, and Barak and Deborah went up with him. Verse 11, now Heber the Kenite of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zanim, which is beside Kadesh. And they reported to Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So he was allies, technically, with the enemy. But he was kind of related to the Israelites as well. He's kind of in an awkward middle place, but he had pledged his allegiance to the enemies of Israel. He branched off. So Sisera gathered together all of his 900 chariots of iron and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth, Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. I love this. Barak, don't doubt for a minute that God has gone down before you in this battle. Don't doubt for a minute. Take your 10,000 men. Today's the day that God is going to set us free. Verse 15, and the Lord routed Sisera and all of the chariots and all of his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Let me stop there for just a second. These were the people who had oppressed Israel for a long, long time. 20 years. 20 years. Think about how old you were 20 years ago. Rewind 20 years. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually do that? Rewind, how old were you 20 years ago? What were you doing in life 20 years ago? Now imagine from that point till right now, your life has been absolutely miserable. You've been hungry many times. Maybe some of your family's been killed. Living in caves. Running for your life most of the time. Oppressed, beaten for the last 20 years. And these are the people that have done it. For them, this was the biggest deal in their whole lives. What is it that you struggle with? What is the hurdle in your life that you struggle with? What is it in your life that causes you pain? What is it in your life that is the biggest challenge that you've dealt with? We all have different things that we struggle with in life, don't we? And it's all different, depending on each one of us and our own scenarios. We all have struggles as well. It's not the same struggle as the people of Israel. It's a totally different struggle. And God deals with our struggles in a different way than he dealt with the struggles of the people there. But God is still in the business of helping us with our struggles, just like he was in helping them with their struggles. God sees every tear that falls from our eyes. God knows when our heart is hurting. You know what's interesting about all these stories, these cycles of stories of Israel going away, coming back, going away, coming back? You know what's really interesting? In every story, God waits to help until he's asked. In every story, it says, and the Israelites cried out to God. They had made their poor choices. They'd walked away from God. God doesn't force himself on anybody. But the interesting thing is, at the end of all of their oppression, when God steps in to help, he waits for an invitation. God is not a forceful God. God is actually really polite. He waits for us to ask. If there is something that seems like a mountain you can't climb in your life, if there's something that you are struggling with that you have no idea how to fix, ask God for help. For a whole lot of years, God has been coming up with solutions to humans' problems that they haven't even dreamed about. In the Old Testament reality, the salvation from being killed and oppressed, the solutions looked grim for the Israelites. We don't have any swords. God says, that's okay. I don't need swords. For them, they had to have swords. God, no. I've got different solutions. All we need is a sharp stick, and we really don't even need that. I'll just give it to him for decoration. It could be a jawbone of a donkey. Doesn't matter what it is. And God steps in with something miraculous that nobody even thought of before. Sometimes we look at the problems in our lives and we think, man, this is probably even too big for God. I probably shouldn't even pray about this. I've never even seen a solution for my problem. It's probably too big to even pray about for God because it would take so much. Do you remember who you're praying to? You're praying to a God who parts oceans. You're praying to a God who speaks and solar systems come into play. You're talking to a God who brings people back from the dead. certainly your problem isn't even that big. Don't be afraid to pray big prayers to God. You've heard me say this line before. I love this line. Don't tell God how big your problems are. Tell your problem how big your God is. Ever since I've heard that, I've loved that phrase. Don't tell God how big your problems are. Tell your problems how big your God is. Because God has 1,000 ways to solve our problems, and we're not even sure of part one, and He's got 10,000 other solutions that we haven't even thought of yet. The story's not over yet, though. It gets pretty intense in this story. Verse 17, it says, however, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of a lady named Jael. Now, this is about 30 to 40 miles north of where the battle happened, where Sisera ends up at Jael's house. He fled, and it's maybe even a couple days to go that far. I don't know how long it would take you to run 30 miles, but it would take me a long time to run 30 miles. You might catch up with me at the end of the week. I don't know. So he goes, he finds the tent of Jael. Now, he knows that these are allies of his, right? Now, the husband is gone, and it's just Jael there, the wife, at the tents, and maybe some servants and some kids. And it says there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber, the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, and do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. And he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a jug of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. Verse 20, and he said to her, stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires, you will say, and says, is there any man here? You will say, no. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg. Now this is an intense story here in the Bible, right? He's laying there sleeping. This is Sisera, the general who has been oppressive for a long time to the Israelites. And there must have been something in this woman who realized that this was an oppressor of God's people. And she needed to do something about it. Otherwise, he might try and hurt them again. There's a connection still to God's people in this house. Now, ladies, I want you to imagine for a moment that you are this lady and you're home alone, maybe with the kids, and you're in this situation. What an intense situation, right? She realized she needed to do something. She's not allowed to have swords. There's no swords in the house, no daggers, no knives, no nothing. But this is an oppressor of God's people. She takes a tent peg and a hammer, and without going into too much detail, deals with it. Now, over in chapter 5, it's called the Song of Deborah. As they celebrate, many times in the Bible, they celebrate military victories with songs. Over in verse 24 of chapter 5, Deborah is singing and calls Jael, she says, the most blessed among women is Jael. Whew, that's a pretty high compliment for this lady, right? She essentially ended it. And she got all of the glory for this battle, right? Who didn't get it? Barak, right? Remember Deborah told him this? The Israelites are free again. And at the end of verse 5, after the song of celebration, because of their freedom, it says, so the land had rest for 40 years. 40 years. And if you look, we see the cycle again. We come into the story of Gideon in just chapter 6, the next chapter. The very first verse of chapter 6, it says, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord again. We see this cycle going on over and over and over again. The first challenge I see to me in this story is to remain faithful to Jesus no matter what. No matter how much time goes by, remain faithful to Jesus no matter what. Don't get distracted. And it's easy to get distracted in our spiritual lives, isn't it? It's very easy to get overwhelmed with all the different things that are going on in life and politics and the world. It's very easy to become overwhelmed. but yet I believe God calls us to a steady and growing relationship in Him. The other thing, I look at the wisdom of Deborah. Her willingness to follow God. You know, it was a dangerous thing that she was involved in. But her faith in Jesus allowed her to have the strength to do something that was uncommon, extremely difficult, and unusual. And in Deborah, God knew He had someone He could trust. He knew He had someone He could trust and count on to share His message. I hope that God looks at me and you and sees the same thing. When God sees us, I hope He sees us as someone He can trust to follow Him and to share His message with the people around us. And the other thing I learned from this story is that nothing is too big or too small for God. There was a story, I really enjoy stories, as you probably know. There's a storybook that we read stories to the kids. This one is called Guide's Greatest Stories from the Sabbath School Guide lessons. And one of the stories is in here from an acquaintance of mine named Keith Kanoki. His father, Phil Kanoki, was a retired evangelist and pastor that was a member of my church in California. And loved that family, wonderful family, and I have a whole bunch of books in my library from his father, Phil. Keith Kanoki is the one that shares this story in this book, Guide's Greatest Stories. There were two little girls. This story comes in 1912, a long, long time ago, 1912, and there were two little girls named Gladys and Lottie. And in 1912, there was no TV. I don't even think there was radio. And out in the country, the big excitement was if there was a big revival meeting in town. Because usually there was some good singing, there was a good preacher that came in, and everybody came from the different farms, and you got to see your friends and any other kids, because life back then out in the country was quite a bit more isolated. So one of the big deals was to go to one of the big revival meetings, an old tent revival. And this family was planning on going, and they had their Sabbath outfits that they were going to wear. And a lot of folks back then didn't have multiple outfits. There was just one dress or one pair of pants and a shirt. And so there was a Friday evening meeting, and these two girls were all dandied up and dressed up and ready to go in their one dress that they owned. And Gladys was a little bit older, and she was keeping her dress nice and neat and clean and wasn't fooling around. But Lottie, little Lottie, was playing with a ball. And the ball went through the barbed wire fence. And so she said, well, I'm going to go get the ball. Well, she has this big, long dress on. And you know what happens when you try to go through a barbed wire fence, no matter what clothes you're wearing, it's probably going to be a snag involved. Well, her dress caught on that barbed wire and tore a big triangular piece on her dress. She was mortified. It was her only dress. She didn't have any other dress to wear, and she was supposed to dress up. Her mom said she had to dress up. And in their family, they decided that she would just stay home. They went to the revival meeting, and Lottie had to stay home. She didn't have her dress. At the meeting, Gladys felt kind of lonely because she didn't have her sister right there. There was an empty spot next to her, and the meeting just wasn't quite the same. Well, during the evening, they had a prayer time. And Gladys offered up a prayer. I'm going to read the rest of the story from this as Keith Kanoki shares it. There was an obvious vacancy in the church pew next to Gladys. Lottie always sat right next to and beside her for a prayer meeting and church service. Gladys felt bad that her sister was absent for the weekend revival as it began. But when it came time for prayer, she knelt and included a new sentence in her petition to God. Lord, please mend Lottie's dress so that she can come to church tomorrow. It was a simple request, uttered in childlike faith. Perhaps fixing her sister's Sabbath dress was too small a thing to ask of a big God. After all, God was probably only concerned about the big problems, like keeping planets on their courses or helping control the weather. Nevertheless, Gladys prayed that the tear in the dress would be mended. Morning dawned bright and clear. It was Sabbath, and there would be a meeting at the church. Family, friends, fun, and food. Gladys bounded from the bed and hurried into Lottie's room to check the closet. Lottie was rubbing sleep from her eyes. She had been totally unaware of her sister's prayer. "What are you doing in my closet?" she protested. "I want to see your Sabbath dress," she said. "You know I tore that dress and will have to stay home from church again today," Lottie said sadly. Gladys paid no attention and rummaged through the hanging clothes until she found the dress. Pulling it out, she threw it across the bed to search for the tear. "Lottie, the tear is gone," Gladys gasped. Both girls scanned the entire dress, every square inch, but could find no trace of the tear. It was as though the dress had never been torn at all. Lottie looked at her sister with round eyes. "How did my dress get fixed?" she asked. "I don't know," Gladys responded in disbelief. "I prayed for God to mend it. I guess he did it last night." Gladys clutched the dress and ran downstairs with Lottie close behind. Mom, Gladys shouted. "The dress, Lottie's dress has been fixed. The tear is gone." Mother was sitting on the sofa talking to her friend Mavis. "Let me see the dress. I didn't have time to repair the tear yet," she said. "You girls just didn't look carefully enough. The tear is there, all right." She began to look for the rip in the garment. She looked and looked. Pretty soon Mavis joined in and was looking as well. Both ladies went over every inch of fabric. But the tear was gone. It had vanished. There was absolutely no sign that the Sabbath dress had ever been damaged. It was like brand new. "What do you make of it?" asked Mavis. "I don't know," Mother said quietly. Gladys couldn't keep silent another minute. "Mom, last night at the revival, I prayed that God would mend Lottie's dress so that she could come to church today. God answered my prayer." The two women looked somewhat skeptical, yet there was no denying the fact that the dress was like new. Maybe God was in the business of answering simple, heartfelt prayers. Maybe God could mend dresses better than the best seamstress. The white dress was proof. God does care about the little things in life. Lottie wore the miracle dress to church that Sabbath and for many Sabbaths to come. Folks all over the San Luis Valley came to see the dress, hear the story, and be amazed. Maybe some of you are wondering if this story is really true. I can tell you for a fact that it is absolutely true. You see, these events happened back in the year 1912. Gladys is my grandmother, and last Sabbath afternoon, I sat and listened as she recounted the story again. Nearly 80 years of retelling have not diminished the wonder of the night that God played Taylor. Oftentimes, we forget that God is a God of big solutions and even small little solutions. Don't be afraid to pray to God for the big ones. You might think that's just too big. I don't think God can help me in that. Pray the big prayers. You may have something in your life that you think is small, and that God maybe wouldn't even care, like he's got too many other things going on in life to pay attention to this little small thing that's bugging you in life. You may think it's just too small to bother God with. Don't forget that God pays attention to the small stuff too. If it's important to you, it's important to God. When I read these stories in the Old Testament, the stories like Deborah, I'm in awe of how much God loves us and goes out of his way to help us. Every one of us has struggles, big and small. Every one of us has hurdles in life, big and small. Every one of us has disappointments in life, big and small. God cares about all of those things. If your heart is hurting, his is hurting too. Don't be afraid to pray for something bigger than you think is even possible. And don't be afraid to pray for something that is small that you think is too small for God to pay attention to. If it matters to you, it matters to God. And God is a faithful God. He's a patient God. God never gave up on his people. When it says God is long-suffering and patient, boy, isn't that the truth? It was then and it is now, and I'm thankful that God is a patient God. I'm thankful that he's patient with me, and I'm thankful that he's patient with you. And even when we mess up, his arms are wide open to us again. When Israel messed up, his arms were always wide open. And he was always waiting for that invitation. With whatever you struggle in life, maybe today's the day that you reach out to God for that help. Maybe today's the day that you put your trust in him and realize that he can do bigger things than even we can imagine. There's a song we're going to sing as we close. I'll invite our worship team to come up. The song is called Great is Thy Faithfulness. And the words go, morning by morning, new mercies I see. And throughout our lives, if we look back from where we sit right now, we see interwoven in our lives the faithfulness of Jesus, who has never, ever given up on us, no matter what. And if he's been there in the past with us, there is no doubt that he will be there in the future with us as we go forward from today. I want to invite you to stand as we sing, Great is Thy Faithfulness.